In rural Michigan, a search for a missing man ends in cold-blooded murder. Investigators call on a team of forensic scientists to establish the victim's time of death and bring his killer to justice. In Salinas, California, a couple finds a skeleton in a shallow grave under their house. A missing persons report, filed 14 years earlier, may have covered up a murder. Bones of lost victims may lie hidden for years. Time and the elements can destroy evidence. When those remains are finally discovered, the deceased have a chance to speak, and the tales they tell reveal grave secrets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The quiet agricultural town of Salinas, California, is known for its abundant produce. A town of hard-working people, it hardly seems the place for a murder. But on January 14th, 1998, the owners of a house discovered something that would change that impression forever. Jim Olson told his wife Sandra and her sister that he discovered something strange in the crawl space under the house while installing heating ducts.
I just happened to look over and there's like a pair of shoes.
He found a pair of tennis shoes sticking out of the dirt, with the toes pointing upwards.
I'm not joking.
I want to see it.
Sure.
That's creepy.
He was too large to reach them in the cramped space. To Jim, it looked as if someone may have been buried in a shallow grave.
I just got out of there. I didn't want to see.
I want to see your touch.
I'm not going back down there.
They all hoped it was a prank.
They're directly back there, right under the kitchen.
We can't just leave them down there. It's creepy.
Yeah, we can.
You know what? I'll go.
But Sandra volunteered to check, just to make sure.
I'll go. Actually, again. Okay, be careful. Slide over here.
Yeah, straight back toward the kitchen. See it?
Something was holding the shoes firmly in place.
It's stuck on something.
In the dim light, Sandra could see that the shoes were attached to a skeleton. Jim called 911. Officers from the Salinas Police Department responded to the call. Sergeant Miller and Detective McLaughlin were among the responding officers. Police confirmed that the bones were human, and the area was declared a crime scene.
Right, Dr. Galloway, as you can see, this is exactly how we found it.
To properly preserve the site and recover the skeletal remains, investigators called in Dr. Allison Galloway, a forensic anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz campus. Remarkably, Galloway found the skeleton to be complete and undisturbed by animals. The initial examination determined that the bones were likely male and that they had been there for a number of years.
We could tell that the body had been there for quite a while. There was no odor, there was no grease in the bone, there was no soft tissue left. So we say usually that takes about 5 years minimum, but it then can go anywhere up to 50 years. So we have quite a long range. We did see a lot of exfoliation of the bone. The bone itself wasn't disintegrating, but it was in a very protected environment.
Decomposed jeans and underwear suggested the victim had been fully clothed at the time of his death and burial. As Galloway carefully sifted through the remains, she found a .38 caliber bullet. Police now believed they had uncovered a homicide. As they scoured the area around the body, they uncovered some personal items, including a set of keys and a cigarette lighter. Sergeant Miller of the Salinas Police Department spoke with the family that currently owned the house.
A couple of real quick questions. Just pretty much the basics as far as when did you buy the house here?
They said that they had lived there for 2.5 years.
And I got the story just real quick. Let me just run it by and see if I got everything straight.
This was the first time anyone had been in the crawl space.
Push it over.
Now, investigators had to determine who this victim was. Without the victim's identity, police would not be able to track his
I
killer.
was surprised at how specific they are. I mean, this one's in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
The remains were sent to the UC Santa Cruz Anthropology Lab. There, they believed Dr. Galloway could provide vital information.
I'll get the bone board so we can do stature.
Okay. I'm going to go with the right femur.
Measurements confirmed that the remains were that of an adolescent male of European descent.
Okay,
He was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall.
Is to 5'10".
Okay.
Okay.
The bullet found among the remains indicated the victim had been shot.
The gladiolus and the xiphoid. On the sternal bodies.
To verify the cause of death, Dr. Galloway looked for any peculiarities on the bones.
Let's take a look at the skull here.
She discovered 2 gunshot holes in the victim's skull.
So, it looks like we have 2 entry wounds over here. This victim, we had a whole series of injuries. We had 2 gunshot injuries to the head, and at least 1 and possibly 2 gunshot injuries to the rest of the body. The first of the head ones came in on the right side, sort of around the ear, and probably exited through the left eye. And then the second injury came in a little bit further forward, and that moved and came out on this side over here.
There was also evidence of at least 1 entry wound to the victim's back.
And rib 7, we also have some breaking. Perimortem, this is around death.
Dr. Galloway reported her findings to Sergeant Miller.
Okay, doctor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
He cross-referenced the address where the victim was found with missing persons reports dating back from 5 years earlier. He came up with a promising match. A teenage boy named Chris DeNoyer was reported missing from the same residence in 1984. Sergeant Miller reviewed the report. There was a picture on file, and Dr. Galloway's assessment was consistent with the missing boy's description.
Chris DeNoyer was last seen January 13th, 1984, and it was his mother who had notified police that, in fact, her son was missing at that time.
Investigators obtained Chris's dental records. Dr. Kevin Landon performed the analysis. He compared the x-rays from Chris's file to slides of the victim's dental remains. He noticed something.
I found that there was a retainer, an orthodontic type retainer on the lower jaw extending from his left canine tooth to his right canine tooth with an orthodontic band around it. During the time that this individual was alive, that was a standard type of orthodontic retainer to place. Nowadays they are made a little different, bonded in the back of the teeth so that they're not so visible.
Dr. Landon had found a positive match.
I concluded that the dental remains from this individual under the house matched the dental records that I received.
Investigators finally had a name and a face for their victim. Now they needed to find out who had murdered Chris Denoyer. But after 14 years, the killer's trail was cold. Little evidence remained. Police were uncertain they would ever solve this case.
Yeah.
Police in Salinas, California struggled to track the killer of Chris Denoyer, whose body was found 14 years after he was reported missing. A .38 caliber bullet was the only evidence the killer left behind. Investigators now needed to reconstruct the events that led up to his death. First, they wanted to make sure there was no access to the crawl space from the outside of the house. They found none.
There's only one way in and one way out. So the two possible scenarios are either it's a stranger or it's somebody that lives in the residence. Now, if you try to play out the stranger scenario, you'd have to say the stranger came into the house, murdered Chris, and then hoped that they would have enough time to drag this body into their house, dig a grave, cover it over, and crawl out before anyone comes home.
And that didn't seem likely to the police.
In my mind, the people that were suspects in this case were anyone that had access and control to the residence in January of 1984.
And the only access was from inside.
I'm not sure.
But Sergeant Miller wanted to be certain that Chris hadn't been murdered after he went missing. He made another call to Dr. Kevin Landon.
One of the questions that Detective Andy Miller of the Salinas Police Department asked of me was that would it have been possible for Christopher to have actually run away, returned a few years later, possibly been murdered by someone and placed under the house? And I could tell him that that was impossible due to the fact that his wisdom teeth had not developed any further.
It was proof that Chris was murdered just before the missing persons report was filed.
Thank you very much.
The police report indicated that Chris had a girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. They hoped she could give some insight into the family.
So she was the first person that we decided to contact, primarily because since she didn't live in the house, she wasn't as likely in our eyes to be a suspect.
She was dismayed to hear the news of Chris's death. She stated she first met Chris Denoyer in 1983. They dated up until his disappearance in '84. Chris, she said, was her first love. When asked about Chris's relationship with his parents, she said that Chris and his stepfather, Jackson Viarta, constantly fought. Viarta was always on him about something. She said she never believed Chris ran away. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye to her.
Hi, Mrs. Viarta. Detective Miller from Salinas PD. We talked on the phone. Thank you.
Investigators decided it was time to speak with Chris's mother.
This is about your son, Christopher Denoyer.
Have you found him?
They tracked her down at her current residence.
And I'm
She was shocked by the news that Chris's body had been found. On the day Chris disappeared, she was at work. Her husband, Jackson Villarta, called her and told her that Chris had run away. She had been convinced he was still alive. In fact, they had received a telegram from him a few days after he disappeared. Chris, she said, was an average teenager, but they had their problems with him. He and his sister were having trouble adjusting to life with her new husband, Jackson Villarta. Investigators asked if anyone in the family owned a gun. She said that Jackson Villarta had one for home security, but she didn't know the kind. Miller didn't believe that Chris's mother had anything to do with the murder.
At the time of this murder, Chris's mother was pregnant, and she's a heavy-set woman to begin with, so the idea of her going through this very small crawl space and digging, a 6-foot trench under her house and dragging a 180-pound victim under there, that's pretty much out of the question.
But they did have a suspect in mind. Chris's stepfather, Jackson Villarta.
Specific there, and you can see from the crime scene sketch here that this body. We felt that the only person that could possibly benefit from burying a body underneath a residence was the person who was in control of that residence, and in this case, that's Jackson Villarta.
Villarta worked for the telephone company. They found him on his route.
Excuse me, Mr. Villarta. How are you, sir?
As investigators approached, they noticed he had the right size and build to dig the 6-foot trench in the crawl space.
We're from Salinas PD.
Mr. Villarta, I already talked to your supervisor.
He agreed to accompany them in for questioning. He was cooperative and admitted that he and Chris had had their troubles. But he said that was normal. Teenagers often have conflicts with their step-parents.
One other thing I'd like to explain to you, a lot of times when people come down to the police department.
Villarta said he worked from noon to 8 p.m. on the day Chris disappeared. When he got home, his wife told him that Chris had run away.
This is Detective Miller.
His story contradicted what his wife had told investigators earlier.
Anything else?
A few days later, he said, they received a mailgram from Chris saying he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused and that he had moved out. Investigators were suspicious. Villarta admitted that he had 2 guns, a .22 caliber rifle and a .38 caliber revolver. The caliber of the handgun interested Sergeant Miller.
The rounds we'd found in the grave, that Chris had been murdered with a .38 caliber weapon. So it was a very significant piece of information.
The police needed to get a search warrant to examine the revolver. They went to Villarta's house to prevent him from entering and removing the handgun. With a warrant in hand, police searched the home where Villarta now lived. They collected the .38 caliber revolver and some ammunition. While they waited for the ballistics testing to be completed, they checked out Villarta's story. They secured all of his personal records for January of 1984.
So we've got to look at this. We've got a call.
There was one small detail that piqued their interest.
We've got a call at 1. Look at this. Hey, Bob. Yeah. Come here and take a look at this.
The mailgram that was supposedly sent by Chris 3 days after he disappeared was ordered from and billed to Villarta's home phone.
So this is dynamite. Right. But we've got to find
Chris had already been murdered.
Was calling these numbers.
Police knew that Villarta had written it.
So there was definitely somebody home. The one sentence in the mailgram that completely gave it away that Jackson was the author was when the statement was that in some ways Jackson was right. And you're talking about a 16-year-old kid who hated his stepfather. Is he going to write in this letter that he thinks that his stepfather was right? The only person that would write that was Jackson. So the whole idea of the mailgram right from the beginning was preposterous.
The circumstantial evidence against Jackson Villarta was mounting.
The house on Navajo Drive.
But investigators would need one more piece of evidence to make an arrest. Detectives in Salinas, California had identified Jackson Villarta as the prime suspect in the murder of his teenage stepson, Chris Denoyer. But they still needed physical evidence to link him to the scene of the crime. A .38 caliber revolver and ammunition were collected during a search of his house. Scott Armstrong, senior criminalist with the California State Department of Justice, examined the gun. He fired the weapon into a water tank. And collected the spent bullets.
The gun, whether it's a revolver or a pistol, will have two kinds of markings that they impress on the bullet: class characteristics and individual characteristics. The class characteristics would be things that would be common to all guns of that make and manufacture.
The individual characteristics are unique markings called lands and grooves, which are left on a bullet as it travels through the gun barrel. They are as individual as fingerprints. Using a comparison microscope, he compared the bullets from the crime scene to the bullets fired from Villarta's weapon side by side. The bullets matched.
There were class markings and individual markings that were sufficient that I could identify the bullet as having been fired from the revolver.
It was the hard evidence investigators needed.
Mr. Villarta, with your left hand, slowly reach out and open the door from the outside. Slowly step out of the vehicle and face away from me. Take 2 steps to your left. Stop. Put your hands behind your back and interlace your fingers. Get down on your knees.
On February 6, 1999, Jackson Villarta was arrested for the murder of Chris Denoyer 15 years earlier. Under questioning, he denied all charges and maintained his innocence. At trial, investigators presented a videotape that proved it wasn't likely an outsider broke into the home, killed Chris, and then buried him in the crawl space. An officer matching Villarta's physical description dug a hole in the confined area. The experiment was timed. It took a little over an hour.
So getting back to the fact that if an outsider had come into this place, done the murder, and decided this was how he was going to dispose of the body, he would have had to commit himself to a minimum of 1 hour in sort of the danger zone, because if someone had come home while he was there, they would have been discovered.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Jackson Villarta and Chris argued that day.
You're going to give me that respect. Yes, you are.
You're not my father.
You're going to give me that respect. Like it or not.
In a rage, Villarta grabbed his .38 caliber gun and shot Chris twice in the head and once in the chest. Then, he hid his body in the crawl space under the house. On February 1st, 2000, Jackson Villarta was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 17 years to life. Jackson Villarta thought that burying his victim under the house would permanently conceal the evidence of his crime. But some killers believe time and the elements will erase the evidence for them. In June 1995, the Lansing Police Department in Michigan was working a difficult case. Detective Jay Trost led the investigation.
Got a missing person, has been missing quite some time. We're looking, I got a photo of here I'm going to pass out, see if anyone here can locate this guy or if everyone else.
29-year-old Mark Bosom had vanished.
Anyone got any questions on him or anything like that?
Do you know if he's supposed to be armed with any type of...
Well, we believe he's more of a victim. We don't suspect he'd be armed, but you never know, so be careful. At this point, I wouldn't really consider it.
Mark's wife, Cindy, reported him missing 3 weeks earlier.
For him, if you find anything about him, anyone that knows him, any information you might think is pertinent, just give me a call or leave me a message and I'll get back with you. He's been missing for...
The longer Mark was missing, the more Detective Trost suspected foul play. He needed to find out if anyone had seen him or knew of his whereabouts. Officers were sent to interview his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They learned that the day before Mark disappeared, he cashed his income tax check and was paid from his job. But dozens of interviews turned up nothing else. The police could find no one who'd heard from him since his disappearance.
He wasn't seen anywhere, couldn't find anyone that had any kind of contact. We couldn't even find anyone that had even seen him or could remember seeing him, anything like that. So he just like vanished.
Sergeant Mark Murray was eager to speak with Mark Bosom's wife, Cindy, the last person known to have seen him. She admitted to him that she and her husband had their problems and were separated as a result, but claimed that both of them wanted to save the marriage.
She appeared to me to be a very loving and caring mother. She and Mark had a daughter, and she seemed to be trying to keep the family together. So they were trying to iron out their differences and get things worked out and patched up.
She told the sergeant that a few nights before his disappearance, Mark visited her at the bowling alley where she worked as a waitress. When he arrived, a man named Tom Hart was talking to her. Mark was uncomfortable with Hart and believed that he was interested in more than just a friendship with his wife. According to Cindy, Hart was infatuated with her. She told Sergeant Murray that on several occasions she noticed Hart following her after work. In fact, her husband insisted that she take out a restraining order against him. But Cindy considered Hart a friend and couldn't believe that he had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. Sergeant Murray wasn't so sure.
Hey guys, how's it going?
What I thought was that led a little more credibility to the fact that some foul play could have been involved in his gone missing as opposed to him just leaving on his own.
Investigators decided to take a closer look at Tom Hart. When questioned by investigators, Hart was cooperative. The 52-year-old claimed that he and Cindy Bosom had more than a friendly relationship. He said that Cindy was planning on divorcing her estranged husband and moving in with him, but was apprehensive about telling Mark. Hart admitted that the last time he saw Mark was the night before he disappeared. he had met with him in person to inform him of their intentions. While Mark wasn't happy about this news, the conversation ended cordially. In fact, he had asked Hart for a ride to a nearby convenience store. Hart agreed and dropped him off. As Mark walked toward the store, he approached two men who were standing outside. He seemed to know them. When Hart asked if he wanted a ride back, Mark declined, saying he'd get one later. That was the last time he saw him. Police asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Though he insisted he had nothing to hide, Hart refused, claiming he had no idea where Mark Bosom was. Investigators didn't believe him.
By his tone and his mannerisms and his basically, it's not that he wouldn't answer questions, but he was very evasive in his answers. He wasn't real forthcoming with a lot of information. We had to pry everything out of him. He would give you an answer to a question, but he never gave you any meat.
Investigators knew Hart was covering up for something. And there was still no evidence of a crime. Police in Lansing, Michigan worked to solve the missing persons case of 29-year-old Mark Bosom. Tom Hart, the last person to see him the night he disappeared, said he dropped Mark off at a convenience store. Investigators doubted his story. They contacted the manager of the convenience store to see if there was a surveillance camera in the parking lot. There wasn't one. And no one remembered seeing either man that night. With no evidence of a crime and only their suspicions that Tom Hart was involved in Mark's disappearance, investigators met to discuss their next move. The investigation was going nowhere. But then they caught a break.
At that point, there was some information that Tom Hart owned a farm. Well, from the time that Mark Bosom came up missing to like within a week and a half, Tom Hart decided to till up his land.
If Hart was involved in Mark Bosom's disappearance, it was also likely he would hide the evidence.
He could have taken him out to the farm and disposed of the body and tilled him up in the soil.
With the assistance of the Michigan State Police, Sergeant Murray conducted an air reconnaissance of Tom Hart's farm.
We were looking for where the ground had been tilled up and disturbed. Maybe a grave had been dug, that the furrows would be different in the ground.
It was a promising lead. But after hours of searching, there was no evidence of a burial or a recent grave. Without a search warrant, all investigators could do was wait.
After approximately a month, there was nothing. And on a missing case like this, it starts to go cold. There wasn't a whole lot more that could be done. What we needed to do is either find him alive or dead, and then go from there. We were unable to find anything.
The investigation had hit a dead end. Trost had been down this road before and knew that someday a clue would turn up. He just had to be patient. Almost a year and a half later, in nearby Shiawassee County, a man walking his dog made a terrible discovery. hidden among some brush, lay a human skull. He called the police. Detective Trost and crime scene technicians from the Lansing Police Department responded. Investigators hoped this was the lead they had been waiting for. Until now, they had a suspect, but no hard evidence of a crime. They collected the decomposed skull, then carefully searched the area.
How long ago would you say you got here? How long has it been?
Nearby, they recovered articles of clothing, a blood-stained blanket, and more human remains. They also found a spent .22 caliber bullet casing. From the level of decomposition, vines that had grown through the tattered clothing, and some insect larvae, they determined that the body had been there for some time. But their search of the area yielded no clues to the victim's identity. Investigators forwarded the skeletal remains to Michigan State University for analysis. There, forensic anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer looked to the bones to help establish the person's identity.
Border of the eye orbit right along here.
After analyzing the shape and dimension of brow ridges on the skull, Dr. Sauer concluded that the victim was male, likely in his late 20s to early 30s. From the measurements of the femur, he determined the individual stood between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall. He also discovered marks on one of the vertebrae, evidence that this victim had been shot in the chest.
Our conclusion was that this was probably a homicide.
David, 314 to Central.
But detectives couldn't be certain that this victim was the long-missing Mark Bosom. The physical description roughly matched Bosom's, but it also matched countless other missing persons. To catch the killer and determine who the victim was, investigators would have to find a way to pinpoint exactly when this victim died.
Not too bad. Just getting some dental records. Oh, it is frustrating, very frustrating. At this point, there's no way for us to say for sure who this person is.
The victim's clothing and the blanket recovered from the crime scene were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Richard Merritt. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Merritt analyzes the life cycles of bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death.
The time of death can be determined using the life cycle of an insect. So basically when someone dies, the insects are attracted immediately to the body within hours.
Dr. Merritt began by identifying each of the species found on the shirt and blanket. Among the various insects present, Dr. Merritt observed an adult parasitic wasp. Though other insects are attracted to a corpse within 24 hours of death, research has shown that wasps will not appear and lay their eggs for several months. Then it takes time for the wasp larvae to hatch and mature into adults. Adding in the wasp's maturation process, Dr. Merritt narrowed down this victim's time of death.
The entomological findings showed that this body had been around from 4 to 8 months, maybe longer, since the person died.
Dr. Merritt's findings held promise. This victim hadn't been killed recently. Forensic botanist Dr. Frank Ewers analyzed the grapevines found growing through the victim's clothing. By examining the internal structure of the wood stems, Dr. Ewers was able to calculate the age of the vine.
Here you can see a growth ring. From this, we can tell that there was quite a lot of growth the previous year. So that meant that it had to be at least 15 months old. And so it told us that the body had to be there at least 15 months.
I haven't got any new information from anybody.
It was the break investigators were waiting for. Cindy Bosom put them in touch with Mark's dentist.
Statements here, what the people had said at the party store.
His dental records were sent to anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer. Dr. Sauer compared Mark's dental x-rays with the post-mortem x-rays taken from the victim's remains.
Once the police had an idea who the remains belonged to, they went to that person's dentist and were able to get a hold of dental records and dental x-rays. And that allowed us to do a side-by-side comparison and positively identify the remains as those of Mark Allen Bosom.
With the help of forensic examiners, police had finally identified the victim. Now they needed to tie Tom Hart to the crime. Looking for answers, they began questioning all known associates of the suspect.
And then let me know what happens.
Will do.
An acquaintance of Hart's told police that Hart owned a .22 caliber gun. In fact, he and Hart had used such a gun for target practice prior to Mark Bosom's disappearance.
You show me how it's done.
Just watch the old timer. I'll show you how it's done.
Okay, great. See you.
The information was enough to get a warrant to search Hart's property. Investigators paid particular attention to Tom Hart's gun collection. They recovered a Winchester Model 94 and a Remington 16-gauge shotgun. Detective Jay Trost knew that neither gun was of the caliber used in the homicide.
I was looking for a .22 handgun, something like that. I did collect some rifles. I didn't really, in my heart, believe that they were involved, but you got to collect everything, and sometimes stories change. So we took what we could find, but there wasn't much there.
18 months after Mark Bosom's murder, investigators had a suspect, but still no evidence against him. In Lansing, Michigan, police were investigating the murder of Mark Bosom. Their suspect, Thomas Hart, was obsessed with Mark's estranged wife. Police had a motive, but no evidence. A search of his property turned up nothing. Investigators learned that the vehicle Hart drove at the time of Mark Bosom's disappearance was parked outside his work. They impounded it for a closer inspection.
Tom, Detective Murray, you remember me? Here's a search warrant. We're taking your vehicle in for processing.
Although the car had been thoroughly cleaned, they detected trace amounts of blood.
When we went through it, we were able to determine with luminol that there was actually blood on the passenger seat.
And that wasn't all. When they cut the seat open, they discovered that the cushion below was covered with dried blood.
It had been there a year and a half, and it was degraded. I mean, it smelled like degraded blood. When you looked down there, I went, whoa. I was expecting little trace amounts of blood. There was like a big puddle of dried blood. So with that was very, very good and exciting evidence for me, because now with this blood, we got somewhere to go. We can figure out whose blood it is. I am assuming at this time that it's probably Mark Bosom's blood. Now I got to figure out how to get that analyzed.
Investigators knew that if both parents were alive, a DNA match could be established.
I knew that the mother was alive. I called her, and she was able to tell me that the father wasn't back alive. So we actually drew blood from both those people. It was turned over to the crime lab along with the evidence they had at the scene, and they were able to analyze that and hopefully get DNA.
They were in luck. It was a match.
The blood in the car matches both parents' blood, which in turn is Mark Bosom blood. So now we got an exact match. And in my mind right now, we got enough probably to get an arrest warrant for murder.
Police finally had the evidence they needed to arrest Tom Hart. But Hart was hiding out at his farm. Because of his violent history, they didn't want to rush the house. And it was only a matter of time before he came out. Police watched and waited.
He was pretty much aware that there was a warrant out for him by now, and he was hiding out.
Looks like he's going to the barn.
He actually walked out, got in the vehicle, and left, and he didn't even go out on the road. I'm guessing if he didn't go out on the road, maybe he thought the police weren't going to get him. But he drove through the field. When they saw that, they just swooped in on him.
Keep your hands where we can see them. Put your hands on top of your head. Turn and face the female officer. Now walk backwards towards me. Walk backwards towards me. That's it. Keep walking. Keep walking. Get to the corner of the car and stop.
He was arrested for the first-degree murder of Mark Bosom.
Tom, we have a warrant for your arrest.
Hey, have a seat, please.
At the police department, Tom Hart was informed of his rights.
You understand you've been arrested for first-degree murder. Before we get into that, I'll talk to you about that.
He refused to answer any questions and demanded his attorney.
We'll get you your attorney. We're ready. We can get someone to come in here. Ready, you can take him down to the jail. Right up there against the window.
He was placed in the Lansing County Jail to await trial.
Take him downtown.
When it became clear that Cindy Bosom only wanted to be friends, a jealous Hart confronted Mark Bosom. He lured him into his car. Then he drove Mark Bosom to a deserted area where he shot the unsuspecting victim in the neck. Hart disposed of the body, believing that no one would find it. On January 9, 1998, Thomas Hart was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some killers believe they can get away with murder. Hiding a body may seem like the best plan, but even when many years have passed and only bones remain, forensic science can find the truth and uncover grave secrets. A young Michigan woman accepts the job of a lifetime and disappears. Now it's the authorities' job to find her. The only clues are some suspicious emails and her new employer's shady past. In New York, an ambitious college student has her whole life ahead of her until she crosses the path of a killer. It's a random murder. the hardest kind to solve. But forensics reveals an unexpected pattern, leading to a game of cat and mouse with the prime suspect. Clues, eyewitnesses, police records. All of these help investigators. But each provides small consolation when the victim or the killer has vanished. In this program, some of the names have been changed. March 25th, 2000, Newport, Michigan. Call it a mother's intuition. When Carolyn Troughton received an email from her daughter Suzette, who'd moved out of state, it was supposed to reassure her. Instead, she called the police.
Tactical Operations, Anthony Burnell, may I help you?
The Overland Park, Kansas police dispatcher connected her with the missing persons unit. Mrs. Troughton explained that Suzette left for Kansas to work for a man named John Robinson. Suzette had packed her belongings and taken her dogs, promising to write or phone. But her mother hadn't heard from her in weeks, until she got the email that didn't sound like her daughter. Detective Greg Wilson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD was assigned the case. Experience told him it was not unusual for young people to move away from home and lose contact with their families. But Suzette, it seemed, was an exception.
Suzette would contact her mother by phone, as well as emails, at least 2 or 3 times a day. Since she had moved to Kansas, the contacts immediately dropped off. So that was of concern to Suzette's mother, as well as the fact that she said that there was never in Suzette's life more than 2 or 3 days at a time that Suzette would go without speaking with her mother.
When she left, Suzette, a nursing student, was excited by the opportunity to care for Robinson's elderly father. Police became concerned when they learned about her employer.
John Robinson was known to some of the investigators in Overland Park that had dealt with him back in the 1980s, and they knew that he had been a long-time career criminal.
In the 1980s, Robinson had been linked to several missing girls, but had never been charged with any crime connected to their disappearance. Investigators from the Overland Park Police wanted to gather all possible information about Suzette's whereabouts before confronting Robinson. Police went to her last known address, a motel.
I'm Detective Bobby Humholt with Overland Park Police Department. My partner Greg Wilson.
The clerk recalled Suzette because she had 2 little dogs, which weren't allowed.
She had a couple dogs.
Once Suzette was told about the policy, the clerk never saw the animals again. The clerk said Suzette's room was paid for by Robinson. He put the room on a business account from a company called Specialty Publications.
And there's your receipt, Mr. Robinson. Thank you.
Suzette stayed at the hotel for 16 days and had checked out on March 1st, almost 3 weeks earlier.
If you think of anything else, could you
The
please
clerk
give me a
provided the security camera tape from that date,
call? Thanks.
which provided investigators with a current picture of Robinson. Then detectives spoke with the housekeeper, who recalled that Suzette had occupied room 216.
Aren't you going to describe him to me?
She remembered that on the day the girl checked out, a man, matching Robinson's description, loaded her luggage into the back of a pickup truck. The housekeeper even described the truck and the luggage. The motel was Suzette Troughton's last known location, but it was located outside Overland Park's jurisdiction. The investigators brought in the Lenexa, Kansas Police Department to help them with this baffling case. Detective Wilson met with Sergeant Rick Roth of the Lenexa Police, sharing what he'd found at the motel. Wilson also told Lenexa PD that this was not the first time they had heard of John Robinson.
We had some good background information on John Robinson, and certain aspects of the disappearances of the girls in the 80s kind of meshed with the disappearance of Suzette.
In the previous cases of missing women, investigators could never find enough to prove their suspicions. And Robinson proved a difficult man to investigate.
The things that really didn't work in the 80s, going and talking to Robinson right away, what that did for him is it let him know that law enforcement was looking at him, that they were actively looking for these people that were missing.
Police believe this gave Robinson time to cover his tracks. Sergeant Rick Roth wanted to talk with the retired detectives who worked the earlier case.
We're going to give it a try. We brought them in, interviewed them. We had their official reports. However, we wanted to get a little further and get their personal views, what went correct in their investigations, what went wrong, their gut feelings, the little tidbits that were not in the police reports.
The more he learned about Robinson, the more Detective Roth began to fear he was running out of time if he hoped to find Suzette Troughton alive. The detective started by trying to track down Suzette's missing possessions.
555-3344.
They made cold calls to area mini storage companies, looking for one that rented space to John Robinson.
Yes, thank you.
They found one.
Detectives went there as a punch key entrance, obtained the records, and found out he had actually been there on March 1st.
That was the same day Robinson checked Suzette out of the motel. Investigators next focused their attention on trying to find her dogs.
The family had told us that if we found Suzette's dogs, that something bad had happened to Suzette. They were like her children.
Officers used the same cold call technique and found Suzette's 2 dogs. They were adopted after being left at a shelter. Investigators now feared their missing persons case had become a homicide investigation.
When we did find the dogs, it was kind of confirmation on our feelings that she was, in fact, dead.
As police began to fear they might never find Suzette Troughton alive, all they could do now was work to try to find her killer before he struck again. As police continued the search for a missing girl in Kansas, they focused their attention on the man who had last seen her, a career criminal named John Robinson. Police wanted to keep a close watch on Robinson, but they didn't want to make him aware of their investigation. Sergeant Rick Roth.
From the lack of luck in the past interviewing John Robinson, we were not going to contact him. And basically, we threw every detective we had into the investigation.
Police put Robinson under surveillance. He was married and living with his family in a modest home. For seasoned investigator Don Lehman of the Lenexa Police Department, his habits seemed odd.
He would do activities during the day, mainly by himself. Would go and visit women that he had coming into town. He would meet them at hotels. Most of his activity during the day was outside of the family, whereas in the evening, he was generally home by like 4 or 5 o'clock, and was kind of, at that point, the family man.
Investigators collected his trash, hoping to find something incriminating. Something to link him to Suzette Troughton or to his cloudy past. Besides his residence, Robinson also owned a small farm with several houses on it. Detective Lehman photographed it.
just to the right of the residence was a small shed, and next to the small shed were just looked like some junk, like some lawnmowers, barrels, things like that, just kind of overgrown area.
But a more immediate clue was coming together at the police station, where a bag of shredded documents was found among Robinson's trash. Strip by strip, detectives found their next leads. Phone records, credit card bills, and internet records. But one piece of evidence stood out.
We found a bill for storage locker over in Raymore, Missouri. When investigators went over there to talk to the storage company, they were able to find that John Robinson actually had another locker there at that same site, but it was actually in one of the other victims' names.
At this point, all the police had were suspicions. They would need some hard evidence to secure a warrant to search the storage locker. They turned to his phone records for that evidence. The records indicated that he'd called Suzette hundreds of times, but not after he'd checked her out of the hotel.
Newport.
He'd also placed calls to several other women, including 2 in Canada.
Another one.
Some of these women were later found to have visited Robinson in Kansas hotels, as Suzette had done.
Ontario.
Every name we ran across associated with John Robinson, we looked at as potential victims.
5 a.m. right there.
The Suzette Troughton investigation began to suggest Robinson's larger pattern of criminal behavior.
Yeah, we got one over here I think you need to take a look at. Yeah,
we had no idea what their role in this entire game was. We didn't know if possibly they were accomplices in a disappearance of Suzette. We had no idea what their role was, and we couldn't contact them because we did not want to tip off John Robinson that we were investigating him.
Because the police still didn't want to tip Robinson off to the investigation, they enlisted help from Suzette's mother back in Newport, Michigan. She agreed to help them gather information about him by recording his phone conversations. She would keep calling him, demanding information about her daughter, hoping he would incriminate himself. But he was too slick. He told her that Suzette was traveling with another man, and he hadn't heard from her either. He never said anything that would help police. Robinson's story seemed unlikely, but the calls did appear to prompt a letter from Suzette, postmarked San Jose. Her mother remained unconvinced. Everything about it was wrong, from what Suzette said to the fact that it was typed. Again, Carolyn Troughton notified the police. Paul Morrison was the Johnson County, Kansas DA assigned to the case.
And these letters that are trickling in from Mexico, from California, talking about what a great time she's having with this new gentleman that she's taken up with. We didn't believe it for a second, but I think the point here is that, number one, we didn't know if we were ever going to find her body. We did believe that she was dead, and we knew early on that we were dealing with somebody that is much more sophisticated than your typical criminal.
It seemed John Robinson had a talent for getting away with his crimes, including the disappearances of 3 other Kansas women more than a decade earlier. From what investigators could tell, everything Robinson did was spun out of deceit.
He was a con artist. Most of his crimes involved financial crimes. He never worked for a business that he didn't rip off, and from what we could tell, he never met anybody he didn't rip off.
Just as police were beginning to fear they may never learn the truth about John Robinson, they got a call from a woman who had seen him for the man he truly was. In Kansas, Suzette Troughton is missing and presumed dead. Police fear the suspect, John Robinson, may be a serial killer, but they have no proof
You have to go find John.
until they receive a desperate call from a terrified woman.
Sexually assaulted in my room.
Robinson had lured her from Texas, and she now gave police some crucial information. Sergeant Rick Roth was one of the principal investigators.
Anybody named John Robinson.
The woman had gone to the office in a rather agitated state and asked who had rented the room that she was in. Management told her it was John Robinson. This woman knew him as James Turner. That further infuriated her, and she started yelling and screaming about the fact that she had been battered and that he had stolen from her.
Armed with this victim's statement, police finally had what they needed to confront John Robinson directly. When they arrived, he was home alone.
Mr. Robinson, a couple of things that we want to talk to you about.
They asked him about Suzette Troughton and other missing women.
For further questioning.
I think I
He
want to talk
pled
about
ignorance.
We'll just hold it right there because actually you're under arrest. For what?
Investigators arrested him for battery and felony theft based on the Texas woman's statement. Search warrant in hand, a small army of detectives and crime scene officers descended upon Robinson's home. As the suspect himself was shuttled off for questioning at police headquarters. It appeared Robinson lured vulnerable women to Kansas with the promise of friendship, jobs, or exciting sex. He set his trap using email, so investigators confiscated his computers. Police also collected bills for storage lockers, credit card statements, and hotel receipts. Lenexa detective Dawn Lehman notes some of the other discoveries.
We recovered several books on creating new identities, make someone disappear, things like that. We recovered letterhead from the CIA, DEA, ATF. We even collected several pieces of information from some of the women from the early 80s that he had kept documents of or notes, probably to keep track of who he had spoken to with their families.
Missing was any evidence leading to Suzette Troughton. Investigators hoped to find it in his computers. Detective Mike Jacobson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD was assigned the task of analyzing the contents of Robinson's computers.
What they wanted us to look for were other victims. Are there other pictures of women or men on these computer systems, people that we don't know about? And in fact, we did find some of those types of pictures. They wanted to know about communications. Were there communications between John Robinson and others, specifically Suzette Troughton and other victims as they were identified?
Investigators determined that the email supposedly sent by Suzette to her family in fact originated from John Robinson's email account. That suggested that Robinson himself had sent them. Police hoped for a more substantial link in Robinson's storage units.
I don't know if at that point we ever thought that there was actually, bodies or anything in the storage lockers, but we felt that there was something that would connect him to these missing women.
They weren't disappointed. Investigators found Suzette's luggage, her computer, clothing, identification, and other personal possessions.
Here's Suzette's driver's license and her social security card.
More incriminating was a stack of stationery pre-signed with Suzette's signature. It was accompanied by a list of addresses and birthdays of Suzette's friends and family. This was the first real indication that Suzette was dead. But if police were going to prove she had been murdered, they had to find her body. Investigators started at the place Robinson knew best, his own farm. Cadaver dogs led officers through the brush and right to a pair of large barrels. Detectives meticulously broke the seal on one of them. Inside, they found a body. The second barrel also contained a body. They now had proof that John Robinson was a killer. Detective Greg Wilson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD.
We don't deal with a lot of murders, thank goodness. When you become a police officer, you hope that you never have to deal with a situation like this. You know, the whole thing was almost overwhelming.
Now, investigators had to determine what had happened to these victims and who they were. It was an enormous challenge. One they presented to Shawnee County, Kansas Deputy Coroner Donald Poyman.
Normally, the bodies come in a sealed body bag, and we know how to examine the bodies. In this case, just deciding how to get the bodies out of the barrels and preserve the evidence was a very tricky situation. Not only because of the logistics of them being extremely heavy, but we had a lot of tissue that had liquefied.
Poyman determined that both victims were young females, and both were killed by a hammer strike to the skull. One had been dead about a month, the other up to 2 years. Upon learning that the bodies had been found on his land, Robinson asked to speak with his lawyer. Investigators respected his request, but not before showing him the room full of evidence they had gathered against him. It included photos of his victims, maps, and surveillance logs. Investigators believed it was finally Robinson's time to wait. After months of investigating suspected serial killer John Robinson, authorities in Kansas finally had him in custody. From the local jail, he and his lawyer were trying to find a way to prove his innocence.
I've been arrested for sexual battery.
So far, the only charges against him were battery and larceny related to the woman from Texas. But with 2 bodies found on his property, Sergeant Rick Roth was determined not to stop until he had brought this man he believed was a cold-blooded murderer to justice. Robinson had slipped away once before. This time, he would not get away.
This was a huge case, biggest case ever worked at Lenexa as far as manpower and time. For 2.5 months, we threw every detective we had into it. And then after Robinson was arrested, I mean, it had increased to like 35 detectives working this case. It was a huge strain on manpower.
Investigators focused their attention on the evidence. Their first job was to identify the victims found on Robinson's farm. Dr. Daniel Winter, forensic odontologist, was asked to assist with the identification.
In the case of Suzette Troughton, we were provided ante-mortem charts and x-rays by her treating dentist. I took x-rays and charted and took photographs also.
If Winter could match the 2 sets of x-rays, then he could say with certainty that investigators had found the body of Suzette Troughton.
We see fillings that are identical between the ante-mortem and the post-mortem x-rays. These are enough points to make a positive identification.
Dental records proved that one of the victims was Suzette Troughton. Investigators also ID'd the other victim as a woman who had been reported missing. They then focused all energy on connecting Robinson to Suzette's murder. They began by studying the letters Suzette's mother had received. Here, too, the tale would be told in the lab. At the Kansas City Police Department, Chief Criminalist Frank Booth extracted DNA from Suzette's body. He hoped to compare it against cellular material pulled from the envelopes that Suzette supposedly sent her family. He wanted to see who had actually sent the letters.
If I can detect that underneath the flap of the envelope, I can then know that I've got an indication I've got saliva. In addition to that, you also slough off epithelial cells from the inside lining of your mouth. These cells are very distinctive in their appearance, and they also contain the DNA that it can identify who licked the envelope.
It wasn't Suzette Troughton. The DNA on the envelopes matched a sample taken from John Robinson. He must have sent the letters to avoid arousing suspicion about Suzette's fate. Robinson's connection with Suzette was linked at a molecular level. Hair and blood cells found in Robinson's storage unit were consistent with Suzette's. And a fingerprint on Suzette's driver's license belonged to Robinson.
I believe Suzette Troughton thought she had the opportunity of a lifetime. When she traveled down here, she was supposed to get a salary of $65,000 a year, a leased car. She was supposed to stay in a 5-bedroom mansion. She was going to travel the world with John Robinson and his elderly father, which was supposed to be her job, was taking care of him.
She never saw it coming. It couldn't be disputed. John Robinson murdered Suzette Troughton and several other women. The evidence had finally caught up with him. It was a fact that did not surprise DA Paul Morrison.
John Robinson had been killing people for over a decade and a half, and he'd never been caught. He knew he'd been investigated at least a time or two for that, and he'd always beat it. So I think to a certain extent, there's a certain amount of arrogance that comes into play, and John Robinson is a very arrogant man.
But John Robinson could not outsmart the evidence. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of first-degree murder. He received the death penalty. John Robinson crafted elaborate schemes to get close to his victims. And in the end, this lethal proximity made it impossible for him to hide. But when the killer is a stranger who strikes and then vanishes, he or she can become nearly invisible. New York, a city of glamour and grit, a town of dreams and all too often harsh realities. In June 1998, a woman on her way to work can't believe what she sees. A body lies across the stairwell of her East Harlem apartment building. The woman called police. The NYPD and an emergency medical team arrived within minutes. But there was no emergency. It was clear that the young woman had been dead for some time. Investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted. And with no identification, that was all they knew about her. Homicide detective Rob Mooney had his work cut out for him.
We weren't sure if she lived in the building that she was found in, and because of the lack of obvious trauma, there was no real cause of death obvious at the scene.
Investigators would have to wait for the autopsy to determine how she died.
The detectives that initially responded to the scene carried it as what we call an investigate DOA, because there was no cause of death known to them and nothing obvious, and there wasn't anybody at the scene telling us what happened to this woman.
At the medical examiner's office, the autopsy confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The technicians performed a rape kit and collected DNA evidence in the event they identified a suspect. The autopsy also showed that her death was not an accident.
The medical examiner's office gives us the cause of death as asphyxiation due to chest compression, meaning that somebody or something was heavy enough and exerted enough pressure on her chest to cause her to be unable to breathe.
Police went back to the apartment building and canvassed the residents to find out if anyone knew anything about the girl. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. And no one had ever seen the girl before. Then, investigators got a call from a woman who was worried that her daughter was missing. Police spoke with the mother. She told them her daughter's name was Rashida Washington. She described Rashida as an ambitious 18-year-old who was working to put herself through college. Police now had a name to try to match with the victim.
The police department has a unit that's assigned to the medical examiner's office, missing persons unit that works there. And when they get a report of a missing person, they normally, through course normal business, will match up missing persons reports with unidentified remains. And that was how the identification was made.
We have a victim.
The woman found murdered was Rashida Washington.
Young lady over on 720 West.
But no one knew how she ended up dead in the building.
Washington.
It was several blocks from her home
Identified. She works
and wasn't
late.
anywhere near her college campus.
She was going to New York City Community College. Could you check on that? Get the.
Investigators went to the school she attended.
Hey, how's it going? Good.
They pored over her class lists, looking for someone who could connect her to the building where she was found. They could find no link. There seemed to be no logical reason for her to be in that building. Next, they went to the dress shop where she worked. They hoped that possibly the manager could shed some light on the mystery of what happened to Rashida Washington.
The last time I saw
The manager told them that Rashida stayed late and did not mention any plans she had made after work.
We found out that she had left work, I think about 9:30 at night, the last day that she was alive, and as far as anybody could tell, took the train as she normally did, and then never made it home.
Police hit another dead end. Investigators again turned to those closest to Rashida.
It's important to find out who's responsible. We can't give it a slow approach. It's got to be done right, and it's got to be done as quickly as possible to try to prevent further crimes from being committed.
They were trying to find out if she had any enemies, anyone she was arguing with, or if she was mixed up with the wrong crowd.
Her family and friends and co-workers were shocked to find out that she had been the victim of a murder. She was not the kind of person that you would normally find in this position.
Desperate for answers, Rashida's family and friends posted flyers throughout the neighborhood.
Clearly, because we had no real lead to work on at that stage of the game, then you have to start with her. And you start to talk to all the people around her. And then that circle begins to expand as you go on to see if we can find out exactly what happened to her. Rashida's case was pretty much of a mystery.
With no information to go on, the Rashida Washington rape and murder investigation faltered. Then, 3 months later, police confronted another case of rape. This time, the victim survived. She accused a resident of her apartment building. The man was arrested and imprisoned for the crime. But in this case, investigators may not have gotten the right man. In New York City, police are struggling to solve the murder of 18-year-old Rashida Washington. They believe that they have their suspect behind bars. But cutting-edge science is about to point the investigation in a new direction. In 1998, state and federal crime labs were setting up DNA databases for criminal cases. While adding the DNA from the perpetrator of the second rape into the database, the lab made two crucial and totally unexpected discoveries. First, the man imprisoned for the crime was innocent. And second, the real culprit had also raped and murdered Rashida Washington.
Match with your homicide case.
Homicide detective Rob Mooney.
The linking of the two cases through DNA was huge for us. That was a huge break. It did not, at that point, tell us who the perpetrator was, but it did tell us that there was at least one person responsible for at least two cases. And it gave us a lot more material to work with because we have a live victim now. We have somebody that's seen the person that killed Rashida Washington can still tell us about.
So the IDs were made by something else. So
But the information from the database did not stop there. It appeared to Karen Dooling, who was an assistant director at the DNA lab for New York City's medical examiner, that the rapist who had turned murderer had been on a spree.
Originally, you had these two investigations that were thought to be completely separate, and one of those investigations was even thought to be part of a completely separate pattern, and how these two cases linked together. And as time went on, you know, within the next year or two in the laboratory, cases continued to link to this pattern, cases that people had no idea were this same perpetrator or that were linked to each other.
From interviews with the surviving rape victim, police developed a sketch of the suspect. It was widely circulated around the college Rashida attended and throughout the city. The investigators' hard work paid off. A woman called with an anonymous tip.
She's pretty certain that the person in the sketch is somebody that lives in her building on East 111th Street. She supplies us with the address of the building and a nickname, Ace, that she's picked up from having had contact with this person in the building. So the detectives then begin to search our databases for people at that address using that nickname.
It brings them their first suspect, a man named Aaron Key, who had a record for robbery, weapons possession, drugs, and other crimes. He resembles the sketch. In addition, the surviving rape victim provided another piece of crucial information. According to prosecutor Rich Plansky,
at the crime scene, the perpetrator discarded a sweatshirt and a baseball cap. She was positive that the person who raped her was wearing both. And as it turned out, the sweatshirt had a partial laundry tag on the back.
Following the only real clue they had, investigators approached dry cleaners near Key's apartment.
Tell me, sir, do you recognize that tag?
One cleaner recognized the distinctive tag as coming from his establishment. He handed over his client list.
Let's copy.
Key's mother was on it.
Thank you very much. I'll give you a card.
In addition to the woman in the building telling us that this is the person that she thinks is responsible for these crimes, we identify who that nickname belongs to, and we have that same person perhaps being the owner of this shirt that's left behind at the rape. So it becomes a fairly intense surveillance on Aaron at this stage of the game. We're watching him 24 hours a day in an effort to try to secure something that will yield a DNA sample. If he smokes a cigarette and throws it on the ground, if he spits out gum and throws it on the ground, if he drinks a soda and throws the bottle in the garbage, get it.
Aaron Key does none of those things. He always seems to be one step ahead of them. But police get lucky when he stumbles.
So we fill out a wanted card for Aaron Key, which means that if he gets arrested any place else in New York City, we'll get notified immediately so that we can do whatever we need to do with this person. And what happens is Aaron gets arrested in Midtown North for an attempted petit larceny.
Believing this is their chance to finally get a DNA sample, police tell Key they need to swab his cheek to test for TB before they lock him up.
But the problem here is, in order for us to be able to use that legally, he had to sign a release that clearly states this is going to be typed for DNA and it's going to be put into the medical examiner's data bank. The second that he read that, he was like, nah, you know what? He goes, I joined Jehovah's Witnesses recently, and I don't think I can do this until I consult with the elders in my church. And that was the end of that.
Not quite the end. Though Key did all he could to conceal his DNA, the authorities stayed one step ahead. They kept a close eye on him in prison, and a guard collected coffee cups from Key and adjacent inmates.
All of them are tested for DNA. All of them produce DNA, but one of them produces DNA that matches the evidence in all of these cases.
Investigators believed that Aaron Key was the assailant in all 5 cases. They simply had to match his DNA to the DNA in the database. But because of the huge number of records on file, that would take time. Time the investigators did not have. With only a petty larceny charge against him, police had to let him go. They try to keep him under surveillance, but he manages to slip away.
We have no clue where he is at this stage of the game. So now it becomes kind of a media blitz the next day. His picture is on the front page of the newspapers because that very morning that he disappears is the day that we get the DNA match back. So he's our guy.
Rapist, killer, escape artist. Aaron Key is on the loose, and he could be anywhere. In New York, DNA has linked 34-year-old Aaron Key to 5 rapes and 2 murders. But the suspect has fled. Detectives kept an eye on his apartment for days just in case he returned. Then, late one night, a light went on. Police wasted no time. But the man inside was not Aaron Key. It was his roommate. Key wasn't there and hadn't been there for days. His roommate didn't know where he was. But at that instant, the phone rang.
That's all right. No, answer it for me, please.
The roommate picks up the telephone, and I could tell just by the look on his face that it was Aaron that was on the phone. I said, give me the phone. They said, you got to come in. Every cop in New York City's got your picture right now.
Key agrees to meet with Detective Mooney to turn himself in.
He says, but I don't want to step out and have 100 cops jumping on me. He says, I just want you by yourself, meet me in the street. So I go, okay, no problem. I said, but make no mistake about it. Don't come in the block with your hands in your pockets or we're going to have a problem.
Police don't want to play any games with Key, and they get his cell phone records to try to pinpoint where he was making the call. They want to pick him up before he has a chance to run again. But they are too late.
While I'm having this conversation with him where he's telling me that he's on a number 6 train on his way uptown to come and turn himself in, he's actually at Penn Station in Newark, New Jersey.
Police then set about using credit card and phone records to try to find Aaron Key. The trail leads them south.
I call up our tech people and I say, listen, dump this phone right now, meaning the phone that was the receiving end of that telephone call. We have that number. I want all the phone calls that came in between these 2 time periods. They determined that this telephone call came from a phone booth in downtown Miami. The next morning, myself and another detective were on a flight.
After arriving in Florida, police tracked down the phone booth Key used. It was located directly in front of a hotel.
We pull into the parking lot and we're setting up and we're figuring we're going to be here all day sitting here watching this hotel to see what happens. And not 5 minutes later, here comes Aaron walking down the street, and he's with a young girl. So I'm thinking, this is bad. This is like victim number 9 walking right past us here.
New York detectives, accompanied by Miami police and SWAT team, descended upon the hotel and sealed the exits.
Let's go upstairs.
They've got Key trapped, along with all of the other guests and hotel staff. Law enforcement swept the hotel, room by room, in search of the elusive Key.
We have an emergency. For your own safety, we need you to clear the building right now.
At last, they find him. Key puts up no resistance, and the girl is safe. If police hadn't found him so quickly, the girl might have become his next victim. Their quick reactions probably saved her life. Key was extradited to New York, where he spent several hours denying his involvement. Even in the face of scientific evidence, investigators needed to find a way to get Key to talk. And one of them suggested that maybe his girlfriend could get him to confess. Against Detective Mooney's better judgment, Key's girlfriend was allowed to see him.
And he spills everything. He admits to every one of the crimes. And of course cannot offer an explanation for why he did it, just that he did do it. This all becomes good, usable evidence for us at trial, because it was unsolicited. She wasn't sent in there as an agent of the police for any reason. In fact, I argued that she shouldn't go into the room.
Though Aaron Key had girlfriends, he was a sexual predator who enjoyed taking women by force. Rashida Washington lived in the same building as Key. She must have known him. And in his mind, because she could recognize him, she had to die. Rich Plansky was the prosecutor.
The case wouldn't have been solved without forensic evidence. Forensic evidence did 3 things in this case. Number 1, it identified Aaron Key for us. Because he left his DNA on 5 of our 7 victims, in the end, it told us this was the right guy. Number 2, it exonerated a number of innocent people, 2 of whom had been arrested and identified in lineups for 2 of the rapes. And number 3, it was instrumental in helping us convict Aaron Key and putting him away for the rest of his life.
Key was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The bottom line is this person is off the board forever. You won't see him anymore. And had he not been taken off the board, more crimes would certainly have been committed.
A killer's motivation remains a mystery, but the residue of his crime lingers. Thanks to the tireless work of forensic scientists, when a murder occurs, it is impossible for the killer to simply vanish.